Jana, who's an energy researcher who supports technical assistance programs. She's got a master's from Berkeley and a bachelor's from Yale and Singapore. Sean Murphy is a department assistant leader. His research focuses on energy efficiency, demand flexibility, and growing electricity loads for buildings. He's worked at National Grid, and he also has a bachelor's in environmental engineering from Johns Hopkins and a master's from Berkeley. Sydney Forrester, her research actually does focus on energy affordability, as well as distributed resources and utility business models. She also has worked at National Grid, which is a utility back east, and she has got so many degrees, bachelor's and master's, from Columbia and University of Michigan. And finally, Jeff is a department deputy leader, and he's a researcher studying energy efficiency, demand flexibility, and other grid edge resources, as well as growing electricity loads for buildings. And previously, he led the energy efficiency practice at the Climate Policy Initiative. Jeff might win for maybe the most degrees, or maybe he's tied with Sydney for degrees. But with all the disclaimers that you heard, we do hope that you will ask questions. Feel free to chat me privately. I'll be moderating the questions, or raise your hand, or just unmute yourself. And also feel free to share with your colleagues comments or questions in chat. All right, let's take it away, Sanjana.
Great. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks great.
Good. Perfect. Awesome. All right. So we're going to start today really defining what we mean by energy affordability in this session, and I'll be walking you through that. So we wanted to start by explaining what we're talking about when we talk about energy affordability today. And our starting point is this definition of energy affordability as the ability of consumers to pay for their energy bills in addition to other basic household expenses without feeling overburdened. We have a related but slightly broader concept in energy insecurity, household energy insecurity. So here, instead of focusing on the ability to pay for energy, it describes the inability to adequately meet basic household needs as energy costs impact households' ability to pay for basic necessities or the energy they need. So in the graph on the right, you can see that figures drawn from the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, and it shows that households reduced or forewent basic necessities or kept their homes at unsafe temperatures or received a disconnection notice. All of these would be evidence of household energy insecurity. These challenges are compounded by rising electricity rates. So retail electricity prices have risen rapidly in nominal terms in recent years. These have tracked inflation till 2023, but are now expected to outpace inflation through 2026. So we have reason to expect that these affordability concerns that already exist are going to be exacerbated. Utilities have requested $29 billion in rate increases just in the first half of 2025, which already exceeds the previous 2024 total. And it's important to note here that state level trends do vary widely, with some states experiencing increases, but others experiencing reductions. We have a quick overview of the drivers of these recent increases. And they include, but are not limited to, infrastructure costs, shrinking loads, renewable portfolio standard programs that require incremental supplies of renewable electricity. And note there that a lot of utility scale wind and solar deployment occurred outside of these RPS programs. Extreme weather, natural disasters, wildfires, fluctuation in gas prices after the onset of the Ukraine-Russia war. So these are some of the drivers of these recent price increases. So now that we have kind of a working definition of affordability, we can turn to how we can measure it. Energy burden is one of the primary metrics of affordability and the most common way that affordability is measured. It's measured by the percent of a household's income spent on an energy bill. So households spending more than 6% of their income on energy costs are considered to have high energy burdens. Households spending more than 10% of their income on energy costs are considered severely energy burdened. So these energy burden targets may be used to cap energy cost a certain percentage of income. So we have an example here, Virginia percentage of income payment plan, where the energy burden target level is 6%. Another metric is the energy affordability gap. So this is the amount that households spend on energy bills in excess of an affordability threshold, which is commonly 6% of income. So how much more are they spending than that affordability threshold? You can see on the figure on the right, that kind of highlights here the household energy budget would maybe be 6% of their income. So the affordability gap is the difference between that target and the actual energy bill. When aggregated across the population, this energy affordability gap represents the total dollar difference between what households pay and what is considered affordable. And because the affordability gap can be expressed as an average per household or as a population weighted measure, it can be used to compare across geographies or across income groups. The last metric we'll be looking at today is the affordability ratio. The affordability ratio is a metric related to energy burden that looks at the ratio of a utility bill to the amount of discretionary income available to a household. So the higher an affordability ratio, the less affordable the utility service. The metric is currently being used by the CPUC as part of its affordability framework. So as you can see here, it is quantifying the percentage that a representative household income would be used to pay for an essential utility service after the non-discretionary expenses are deducted from the income. So these are all different metrics that we can use to measure household affordability. We're now going to move on to looking at the ways in which states and utilities can support affordability. So state PUCs have statutory mandates that establish broad standards for the regulation of these regulation of utilities, and these standards typically include just and reasonable rates, which can be interpreted as a mandate to ensure affordable energy for customers. State regulators and utilities can support affordability by incorporating the following principles in regulation. So first is cost control. Here, this means ensuring cost of service is no more than necessary when regulators approve rate increases. This includes both approving cost recovery and rates for particular expenditure, as well as how they're included. So it may be included immediately or over time. The second is cost responsibility, which means ensuring that the costs are allocated across groups and not disproportionately borne by any one group. The third is predictability, which requires ensuring that customers can predict their bills, therefore being able to budget for them or plan for them. And finally, the last is incorporating principle of agency, which is just how much influence customers have over what their bill is. At this point, we're going to split up into breakout rooms. You're going to be split into pairs, and you'll be focusing on these two questions. How is energy affordability showing up in your work? And then what affordability challenges does your organization or jurisdiction face? We'll give you a little reminder at the 3.5-minute mark. And at that point, you can switch. So our vision for this exercise is you'll be split up in pairs. Each of you will answer these two questions. And then at the 3.5-minute mark, you'll switch so your partner can answer the same question. No worries if you can only get through one. This is really just designed for you to be able to reflect on how energy affordability is showing up for you in your work. All right, welcome back. Hopefully that was a good chance to connect with some of your peers and to reflect on how energy affordability is showing up in your work. Like that is the conclusion of this initial section on energy affordability. And now I'll hand it over for the next speaker to take on bill assistance strategies.
Great. Well, thank you, Sanjana, and hello, everyone. It was nice to meet a couple of you in the breakout right now. I'm Sean Murphy from Berkeley Lab, and I'll be talking about a number of different strategies that utilities, states, and sort of any other entities that are engaged in energy, be tribes as well, can have to address affordability through sort of helping bills become electricity and gas bills be more affordable for their customers. So if you could move to the next slide. Oh, that's the one. So I've organized these strategies into 4 high-level categories. I'll walk through details in each of them, but I just want to sort of introduce some of the key concepts at the start. So in the top left, we have just the idea of reducing customer bills. The specific strategies that I'll talk about here are really related to rate design, but the goal is that you can make electricity or gas bills lower, which makes them easier to pay. So when people are struggling to pay their bills, of course, a lower bill is always going to be helpful. There's a lot of ways that you can go about trying to achieve that outcome, and that's where some of the nuance and the interesting things come in. So some of the sort of specific strategies here are discounted rates, block rates, which sort of price different quantities of all electricity at different levels, and then percent of income payment plans, which I think Sanjay actually had as an example in one of the preceding slides. And those, the rate, the price per kWh or therm is dependent on customer income levels. In the top right is this second category, sort of encouraging regular bill payment and sort of managing bills. So customers may fall behind on paying their bills, which could lead to late payment penalties, the accumulation of sort of a debt to utilities, and the possibility of disconnection. So there's some potentially serious outcomes that can result. And strategies such as bill prepayment and budget billing can help sort of decrease the likelihood of some of those negative outcomes. In the bottom left, I have this category of helping people repay unpaid bills. So as I mentioned earlier, customers who miss payments may face penalties and see unpaid bills pile up. In utility speak, that's often called arrearages. So you may encounter that term. It's sort of the amount of money that you owe the debt to the utility for non-payment. So arrearage management programs can help customers repay these debts and also have them forgiven. And then this final category in the bottom right is leveraging federal assistance programs. The Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, was a longstanding program available to states that provide short-term relief to customers who cannot pay high energy bills. So in the next several slides, I'm going to go through each of these in detail and provide some examples from utilities sort of illustrate these strategies. So next slide. So the first category of these rate design options I want to discuss is the discounted electricity and gas rate. And they are sort of what they sound like. They're rates that are lower than standard rates by some percentage. These rates are not available to all customers. They're going to have eligibility criteria. Most often, that would be considering income, but some states may also account for whether a customer is already receiving some sort of state or federal assistance. So that could be sort of Medicare savings program or SNAP benefits. Those things could qualify you to be on these types of rates. So these rates may be flat in the sense that they provide the same discount to all customers who are eligible, or they may be tiered such that the scale of the discount changes with the eligibility criteria. So Unitil, Massachusetts, for example, has a low-income electricity rate that provides a flat 40% discount to everyone who is eligible for the rate. In contrast, Eversource, Connecticut's electric discount rate adjusts the discount level depending on household income and the number of people in the household. So if you have a lower income, you may receive a higher discount. And if you have a higher income, you would get sort of a lower discount. And the Eversource program also considers whether customers are in any different public assistance benefit programs as well. These rates could apply to an entire energy bill or only a defined amount of consumption. So if we look at that Eversource program, it's only covering the first 1,200 kWh in each month of electricity consumption. The figure below sort of illustrates a hypothetical bill for an Eversource customer. So the green is representing the electricity consumption that would be covered by the discount, and then the orange is the electricity consumption that wouldn't be covered. And you see in most months, all electricity is going to be covered. But in those higher electricity consuming months, particularly say in the hot summer, there might be some consumption that's not covered in that bill. So that's the discounted rates at a high level. And on the next slide, I'll talk about a few more sort of ways rate design can be used to promote electricity and gas affordability. So for a lot of customers, winter heating bills are often the highest in the year. So in jurisdictions with high levels of electric space heating or where there's increasing adoption of these technologies, the concern is that there's a concern that winter bills for electricity, as opposed to summer, may become particularly high. So some states do offer rates that are specific or only available to customers with technologies such as heat pumps and electric resistance furnaces. And the idea here is that if you offer a rate that is slightly discounted for people with those technologies, it's going to be a little bit less costly to stay warm in the winter. And the goal is just to reduce the cost of operating your heat pump or your electric resistance furnace relative to when you had a standard rate. So there's two examples that I draw here from Maine, where they're typically a pretty cold winter, and there's some longstanding level of electric heating there. And there's two different designs that these utilities have put forward. So there's one that's offered by Versant Power. It has what's called a declining block structure. So basically the price of electricity is lower at higher levels of consumption. So hypothetically, for the first 1,000 kWh, maybe you pay 10 cents kWh, but above 1,000 kWh, maybe the price goes down to 5 cents kWh. And the expectation is if you're using electric heat, you're going to have a lot of electricity consumption. So it's providing sort of a discount for that additional heating that you need. And another strategy that's just used by Central Maine Power is to just give sort of a discount on all of the kWh that are electricity consumption for people with those eligible technologies. So there are different ways to use rate design to achieve that same outcome of reducing the cost of operating electric heating equipment. This next example is of an inclining block rate that's available in California. So this figure that I have here comes from San Diego Gas and Electric's, I think, standard offer rate for residential customers. And they use this inclining block rate to basically give a discount to the initial quantity of electricity that's consumed. The motivating idea here is that people need electricity for basic energy services, like keeping the lights on in a literal sense, and some level of basic space conditioning that keeps people comfortable. And also there are customers who have medical equipment, and you need to be able to power that medical equipment for health purposes. So the idea by making that initial quantity of electricity less costly, you make it more affordable to have those basic services. And this rate design here that California or San Diego Gas and Electric offers does adjust the price of electricity based to make it more affordable to have a little bit more space cooling in the summer in the hotter regions of the state. And also, if you have some of that medical equipment, there's an additional sort of discounted quantity of electricity available to each customer. If you move to the next slide. So this is the last example I have of rate design and how it can sort of be a strategy for promoting electricity and gas affordability. And it's the case of that percent of income payment plan. So in these states, or sorry, in these plans, states are setting a cap on how much someone can pay for an energy bill based on their income. So Ohio has a pretty long-standing PIP plan, as it's called, in which they're setting their caps based on the type of heating fuel at the home, the household income, and the size of the household. The table on the right is the sort of lookup table that they use to determine the maximum income that's eligible for different household sizes. They then set a bill cap of 5% of your income level for gas and electric, respectively. So if your home has gas heating, you can only pay 5% of your income on gas, and you'd have 5% for electric. But if you have electric heating, then it becomes 10%. So if, say, there's a household of 2 people and the 30-day income is, I think, $3,000, that's within the limit in this table, that would mean you have, I think, $150 maximum payment for your electricity bill. It's always possible that you would be using less than that. So there may be cases where this plan may not actually reduce the bill because you're not using enough. But if, say, you use $300 worth of electricity, you'd only be paying $150. And then that differential, that $150 differential, could either be covered by other utility customers or some sort of non-utility funding. So there may be some sort of gap in sort of distributional question there of how those costs are recovered. Next slide, please. So the next category is budget billing. So we're moving away from, well, this is still sort of a rate design in a sense. So in contrast to the goals of these rate designs we were just discussing, and the goal of budget billing is not really to reduce energy bills overall. It's to sort of encourage more regular and consistent bill payment. So budget billing does this by spreading out the cost of energy used during high demand times of the year. So oftentimes heating and cooling needs are driving bills in the summer and the winter, respectively. And customers may struggle to afford those bills specifically. A really cold January and a really hot August may be the bills that are the ones that someone can't pay, but the rest of the months could be fine. So the idea with the budget billing is that you can sort of spread those costs over time and then there's no bill that becomes a big spike. They're just sort of all averaged out. So this consistency, the theory is it would then maybe improve the likelihood of on-time payments. Often utilities will sort of set this budget bill based on the preceding 12 months and then make regular adjustments. So it's always sort of accounting for changes in weather, changes in building occupancy and building behavior. And as a result, with the budget billing, some payments may be higher and some lower in the months than they kind of otherwise would be. So if we look at this figure on the bottom, which comes from NV Energy in Nevada, it's illustrating a potential bill for someone participating in their budget bill program. The yellow circles represent a monthly budget bill payment, and then the blue bars are representing the historical payment that they use to calculate that monthly payment. And you see in, say, March and April, the budget bill is a little bit more than what you probably would have paid in the preceding April, but it's a good deal less than what you were going to pay in July and August. So there's sort of this offset where you pay a little bit more in April, but pay a good deal less in July and August, and it evens things out. Because of this sort of smoothing, there really isn't a change in overall bill payments in the long run, but there are some sort of short-term adjustments. Next slide, please. So now to talk about bill prepayment. So with bill prepayment, customers effectively set their own budget for energy expenditures by paying upfront. This is analogous to, say, buying a certain amount of data or minutes on a phone plan, and then as you're making a phone call, those minutes go down. So as you're using your electricity or gas, your sort of balance would go down with each unit of consumption. So if you put $100 in, you can then sort of use electricity until there is $0 left in the balance, after which electricity service would be shut off unless the balance were refreshed. Prepayment does require some setup. It may require special equipment or advanced metering infrastructure and changes to utility billing systems. So there is sort of an upfront commitment from the utilities perspective to enable this process. In the US, prepayment is most common in cooperative and municipal utilities. I think the largest program is offered by Salt River Project in Arizona. And this figure that I have here comes from their prepayment program. It's been going on for a while, and they now have an app that allows customers to keep track of their current balance, their energy usage, and then an estimate of the number of days until the balance is zero. One important consideration with prepayment is that some folks have pointed out this may lead to some rationing behavior, because if you know you only have, say, $100 of energy consumption, you may use less when you may really want to use it because of that budget. So there are certainly some trade-offs that exist with the prepayment. Next slide, please. So now for arrearage management programs. So when utility, as I mentioned, when customers do not pay their bills or not pay them in full, you can accrue these arrearages. So for customers who already struggle to pay bills, paying these arrearages could be a significant challenge. Through the arrearage management programs, utilities may forgive these arrearages if customers make regular payments over a defined period, often a year. So each on-time payment can reduce an arrearage balance. So a hypothetical example would be if a customer has $1,200 in arrears, and then they make on-time payments for a year, and each month sort of reduces that balance by 100. After a year, you'll have $0 in arrears. Utilities may set caps on the maximum amount of arrears that can be forgiven. National Grid Electric allows for up to $12,000 in arrears. I think that's probably on the higher end of what utilities have offer. So there definitely can be a range, and it varies within state and across states. And utilities also may require that customers use budget billing while they're going through this sort of forgiveness process, so that it's more likely that they make their payments on time. And then they also sort of limit eligibility to customers who have a minimum amount of arrears, with the idea being that you want to prioritize the customers who may be most in need or having the hardest time to pay their bills. So as with the percent of income payment plans, some funds must offset the forgiven arrears. And states and utilities have multiple approaches here. And they could come from other utility customers, or also non-utility funding. It could be state funding as well, but there is some sort of gap to be closed. Utilities also may offer bill payment programs that don't include forgiveness. So an example here is Xcel Energy Colorado, which allows customers to repay arrears over time. And they'll do this, though, on top of their regular bill. So if I owe my normal bill is, say, $100, but I need to pay down a debt or arrears of $200, maybe I have an extra $20 on top of each of my bills. So that could sort of add to or make it harder to continue to pay your regular bills when you're also paying your energy arrears at the same time. And next slide, please. So the last strategy that I'll cover today is leveraging federal assistance programs. As I mentioned earlier, LIHEAP is a federally funded block grant program that states, tribes, and territories can use to reduce the cost of utility bills. They do this by basically providing a payment to a utility on behalf of a customer. So I can apply to LIHEAP, and then LIHEAP will then reach out to my utility and say, we know that this person, we're going to basically say, here's $100 on behalf of this person to cover their bills. LIHEAP also provides emergency support during weather emergencies and help households reconnect utility services after disconnection, and provide some funding for weatherization projects. The program is income qualified and, as I mentioned earlier, open to states, tribes, and territories. About 90% of LIHEAP's 2025 funds have been distributed to these administrative agencies this year, but all of the LIHEAP staff were let go from the Department of Health and Human Services earlier this year, and it's unclear what will happen in 2026. But there are still a significant amount of funds that have made it to the states for disbursement in 2025. Next slide. So in designing any of these bill assistance strategies that we've discussed so far, states are going to have numerous decisions about who is eligible, how enrollment works, where the funding comes from, and then how to administer the program. In terms of eligibility, as we've seen, it's often based on income, in particular household income by the number of people in the house. And it's also, programs may also consider whether a customer is participating in another means tested program. So an example here is in California, where they have these low income discount rates that you can become eligible if you're already in a program such as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance, SNAP program. So if you're already in that, you're immediately eligible for the discounted rate. Utilities also may prohibit participation in some programs from customers who participate in other programs. So NV Energy, for example, they have that budget billing program that we looked at a couple minutes ago, but they don't allow customers who are on net metering for rooftop solar to participate in that budget billing program. So within sort of the utilities portfolio of programs, there may be some restrictions about how you can move between them. And enrollment often it requires that customers apply and be screened, but it's also possible that they become automatic. So New Jersey, for example, automatically enrolls customers who are already on a discounted rate into an arrearage management program if they fall behind on bills. And that automatic enrollment sort of removes the possibility that someone doesn't apply and get on. It just immediately addresses the need that appears. And as I mentioned earlier, there's multiple funding sources that are possible for all of these strategies. It can come from other utility customers, so collected on rates, and it could also come from state budgets. So Illinois, for example, uses the state funds to partially fund its percent of income payment plan. And then some states will also use LIHEAP funds as part of their funding strategy for particular initiatives. And in terms of administrative effort, whenever there is some sort of screening and eligibility criteria, that can be a sort of barrier to participation because you have to go through this process of enrolling and verifying. So when you have the eligibility based on participation in other programs, that could just address that barrier and make it easier for people to participate. And then the next slide is the last one. Overall, studies on the impact of these bill assistance strategies have been somewhat limited, but I wanted to include some links here to some resources that you all may find helpful if you're engaged in any conversations about these strategies in your jurisdiction. So each of these links to an evaluation, mostly within the probably past 10 years, not all of them are super recent, that will provide some detail on the impacts that have been observed and particular program design considerations that may be earth relevant. But it's certainly an area of continued interest, and hopefully there'll be more evaluations of these types of programs in the future. And with that, I'll hand it off to the next speaker.
Wait a minute. We have a question in the chat, and I'd like to ask you. So the question is, there seems to be many rate structure types that utilities can model. What are the philosophies or maybe principles or that utilities are considering in their process to design rates for customers?
That's a very good question, and it's certainly a big one. This would be a good exam question for someone studying energy policy, because there are longstanding sort of principles of rate design that are sort of perennial and apply. And I'm going to try to remember as many of them as I can right now. But there is the idea that you're trying to charge people for what it costs they're causing and sort of recover those in a transparent and clear way, so it's easy for people to understand why they're being charged what they are. But rate design is there's a lot of details to it. So there's more ways that you could sort of address the costs of charging electricity than what I covered in just this presentation. And I'm happy to think about this question a little bit more and maybe send you an email with a few sort of additional thoughts.
I'll put a link in the chat in a minute to the Bombright principles that you're referring to. Revenue neutrality is a really big one. Utilities not collecting any more or less in terms of revenue requirements. So that's a big one. Simplicity of design, rate design, understandability. There's so many, but I'll put a link because that was such a good question. Here's another one. This person says, I've heard some discussion of using inclining block rates to temper concerns of increasing rates from data centers. do you know of any jurisdictions have already implemented this for areas impacted by data centers? I'll start out by saying inclining block rates are pretty common around the country to begin with. There's been some retreat away from them because of electrification. Sean, I don't know if you have other thoughts there.
Yeah, I haven't seen any examples specific to that in the context of data centers. So I don't know if I can directly answer that question.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, good. Jeff just provided me a
Yeah,
link
I
to.
just sent you a link if you want to include that on.
Great. I will go ahead and shout that out. Anybody else have a question they want to ask Sean, or otherwise we'll pass it to the next presenter, who I believe is Sydney. All right, let's move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Lisa. So I am talking about sort of moving from just the bill structure and bill assistance programs to actually looking at different devices and programs that could help reduce bills that way. So next slide, please. So I have here just that DERs, or distributed energy resources, are able to essentially improve affordability. This depends on a few different things, and it also depends on kind of how you structure the bounds of what you're talking about when you're talking about affordability. So Sanjana kind of defined affordability, but when we're thinking about different DERs, you can see affordability at the household level, so at the adopter or subscriber level, and how a DER program impacts their bills. But also moving beyond that, you can look at the sort of wider societal impacts. So the cost of a DER program might fall to, for example, the ratepayers, but also there could be benefits felt across the whole grid to all the ratepayers, such as increasing avoided costs or different things that come with, grid services that a DER might provide. So I have here a list of different benefits that could sort of accrue to either group. So of course, at the household level, you can see bill savings and different co-benefits like health and comfort. And then at the wider level, again, you could see different grid benefits, things like peak reduction, other services, and then Sanjana and Sean kind of touched upon different designs and how to sort of reduce cost to administer different programs. So, for example, Sean talked about bill assistance programs, but also like the amount of arrearages that could be forgiven, and that obviously would impact potentially the rate base or tax base. And so reducing the need for some of these assistance programs, or reducing the risk of things like delinquency or defaults, or even the need to send out a crew to disconnect or reconnect a customer, could actually lead to savings again at the whole wider societal level. So if you have a case where a DER would be beneficial to affordability at one or both levels, it's sort of like, great, how do we then get people to adopt DERs where it makes sense? And this is happening in a variety of places just naturally, but there are still significant barriers to DER access. And this is especially felt in certain pockets of the market, like low-income households, or maybe in more rural places. But there are different kinds of barriers. One is just the high upfront cost that some of these technologies can incur. And if you are able to access it via financing, how is that financing structure? Do you have access to low interest or cheap capital? And how are the consumer protections? Also, if you are going to acquire a DER that's tied to the property, usually that comes with a need for ownership of that, space or rooftop. So obviously that is easier when you are a homeowner and in a single family home. So there are a bunch of programs that focus on DER adoption, and there are a subset of those that focus just on these different underserved markets, so like income qualified customers. Next slide, please. This is going to be very high level, but just running through a few of the different sort of programs that are out there. So Energy efficiency and demand response. Sean mentioned LIHEAP with one of his last slides. Another federal program is the Federal Weatherization Assistance Program, which has also been around since the 80s. So that is very long standing. And it essentially was to improve, it was started to improve affordability when rates were increasing back then due to different things going on with oil. And Sanjana mentioned how we're seeing a very recent increase in rates lately that has sort of diverged and increased beyond inflation. Whereas, we have seen rates increasing with inflation for the most part before then. So, it's important to look into these programs and how to essentially get some low-hanging fruit. So energy efficiency and demand response programs can be pretty cheap compared to some of the other programs I'm going to talk about, like rooftop solar or battery storage. Also, compared to things like bill assistance programs, if you make these improvements, they last for the lifetime of the asset. So if you're improving insulation, it's not like that disappears the next year. It sort of lasts as long as it lasts. So you'll get those savings on an ongoing basis. You also see different co-benefits, like I mentioned. So you could see like a less drafty home, your property value go up, etc. It does, when you look at other programs versus energy efficiency, it depends on the thing you're improving. So you can only make so many improvements before each next improvement is marginal and more expensive, or more incremental and more expensive. So that can be a bit of a barrier to getting super deep savings on your bill. Also, housing conditions might prevent participation, things like asbestos or electric, like your electricity setup and whether or not it is up to code. So I have a bunch of best practices here, but essentially to ensure net bill savings. So if you are paying for any amount of those upgrades, making sure that the savings are greater than the cost. And again, that's sort of like on a monthly basis, not just over the lifetime, because a household realistically has to start paying month to month, as opposed to like being able to fund it for, say, 10 years. Also braiding various funding sources to, again, sort of increase the benefits and sort of decrease the cost, and cross eligibility with other programs. So I think this was previously mentioned, but if you're eligible in one assistance program, making it automatic that you're eligible for this program. So this could also be paired with things like home repairs or different other DER programs that I'm going to talk about later. I did mention a couple of examples, the Weatherization Assistance Program and the one to the right, the Empower Maryland program. They both offer upgrades at no cost to the home. And Maryland is a state program, so they actually do increase some appliance work and also some home repair work. And they do have that categorical eligibility, which is the same as the sort of using eligibility in one program to apply to the other. And also for demand response, there are things as simple as smart thermostat programs where a utility might give a household a free thermostat, a programmable thermostat, in exchange for their enrollment in a demand response program. Again, sort of making sure there's some grid benefit to counteract the cost of giving a free device. So next slide is on community and shared solar. So this is essentially solar that is installed off-site, a big system, or solar installed on a multifamily rooftop to give access to more than one household. So this is usually done with a subscription model, and it allows access to solar without a rooftop or upfront costs, and this even works for renters. And actually, we had some colleagues do a study, and they found that community solar subscribers were more likely to, compared to rooftop solar adopters, to one, be a tenant, so be a renter, two, live in multifamily housing, and three, be lower income. And this was due in almost equal parts to the fact that community and shared solar just allows for that, just on its own, just general community solar programs, but also in the second part to specific LMI household design elements. So those might be things like guaranteed bill savings, or different carve outs. So 20% of the capacity must go towards LMI subscribers, or also subscription models that might be very flexible. So if you are a renter and you want to participate in a program, you don't want to be locked in for a very long time if you are thinking about, moving in a year or so. So am I able to basically join and leave as I wish? So there are different examples. So these three Solar for All programs they predate the federal EPA program. So DC, Illinois, and New York all have different community solar aspects to their Solar for All programs that are have already begun and are ongoing. And then the example I have here is the solar on multifamily affordable housing in California that also has been going on for a while. And that basically has provided, I think they said, an average of $80 worth of savings per participant. And they've, done hundreds of, or maybe over 300 installations with a lot more households, obviously benefiting. So next is rooftop solar. And this is it's specifically to the rooftop of usually a single family owner occupied household. And so this again is a bit different than multifamily solar because a lot of these benefits more benefits are available, but for a smaller number of households, for mostly that one household. Again, it can have different costs and benefits that are wider than just that household. But so for the household itself, there is a potential for larger savings and also just ownership of the system. Solar is costly, and there are different barriers associated with that, additional to barriers for renters and multifamily dwellers. But there are programs that focus on cost-effective solar and how to basically incentivize that adoption. I should say that these programs vary pretty widely. It could be things like just buying down the cost of solar a little bit or offering, again, some friendly capital and financing with good terms, all the way to financing the full cost of a system. And that obviously has different trade-offs. So here again, on the right-hand side, this is DC's Solar for All program. They actually have a report out that kind of analyzed the different impacts. So at the time of Groundswell's report, there were about 1,500 subscribers that got a 3.5 kilowatt system. And the annual bill credits were about $520 on average. So again, that sort of goes to the point where you can have a huge impact on a smaller number of households. So the next slide, sorry, I'm moving through these quickly, but again, keeping it high level, so hopefully everyone's following. Battery storage is usually on a residential level tacked on to solar. And these programs have cropped up in more recent years. Storage is still quite relatively expensive. So they sort of incur the same challenges they have the same challenges that rooftop solar has, but maybe even more of those cost barriers associated. The one perk that it has for the household who adopts it is that there is sort of an outage protection element. So if you if you have a long outage, you can ride through with a certain amount of your load covered by your solar and storage system. Another benefit of storage is actually, again, felt at that sort of wider level. So that sort of ratepayer base. Storage is dispatchable, and there can be a lot of grid benefits if they're dispatched in a certain way, both in the sort of charge direction and the discharge direction. So the best practices I listed here include pairing batteries or battery incentive programs with programs that also increase societal benefit. Again, those costs are much higher, but the opportunity for grid or societal benefits is also much higher than solar alone. So it will depend very much program to program on how those different things weigh out. But, you know, certain designs can basically incentivize maximizing affordability for the household specifically, and again, increasing grid benefits such that, you know, it can be affordable again for the whole population, you know, ratepayer, taxpayer, whatever. So the different programs I have here, I call out the California self-generation incentive program. So this is a larger program, but I just put a news article from this spring on the side. So this specific program, Haven Energy, they anticipate 10 megawatts of distributed capacity, and so on that grid benefit note, they are basically talking about a virtual power plant. So these customers that get free solar plus storage are automatically enrolled in eligible DR or demand response programs for 10 years. So this would be essentially peak services. So time of use load shifting, which also would impact, which would increase, you know, customer bill, or would decrease customer bills or increase savings. So time of use load shifting, capacity bidding, and critical peak pricing. Critical peak pricing is just a more sensitive price signal to customers to reduce, or in this case, to discharge power. And they also mentioned that net of fixed charges, customers should see 80% to 90% reduction in monthly electric bills. So again, really big impact on affordability for that household. And then they're hoping, again, benefits at the wider level. So the next slide is a program that is actually technology neutral. So here's just talking about financing, because I mentioned it in a few slides. So financing essentially allows for adoption without any upfront costs. Some of them are structured such that the bill savings can exceed the loan repayment, so that there is sort of net savings guaranteed just right off the bat for the household. The challenge is that, you know, customer protections should be strong, especially for low-income customers. And also, not everyone might qualify with the underwriting criteria of looking at a credit score. So there are different things that could happen. So looking at utility bill repayment as sort of alternative underwriting criteria. Also, different things like on-bill financing. So being able to pay back on your bill. So instead of seeing a big discount in one space and then having to pay a separate bill, just seeing sort of a smaller net discount on that bill and getting to pay back there. And so I have an example here on the right. This is so Mass Solar Loan. So they have a larger program. Massachusetts has a larger program, and over a 5-year span between 2015 and 2020, they found that over half of their loans were to LMI residents, despite it not being an LMI specific program. I pulled out 2 different things that are specific to LMI or income qualified customers, but essentially they offer an interest rate buy down. So if you qualify, they basically are able to set up the loan loss reserve to make you more attractive to financiers, and there is a 3% interest rate reduction. And they also have this income-based principal reduction. So that essentially is kind of like an upfront incentive, where if you are trying to take out a loan for $15,000, or sorry, $15,000 for like a solar array or whatever, 30% off all of a sudden lowers that about a third. So now you have a loan for $10,000 principal. So I have here on the next slide just best practices, but I am just going to run through. It is essentially just trying to figure out ways to improve affordability, not only at the household level, but at the larger societal level, to improve bills for everyone. And also just a bunch of other things that help that along the way. So customer protection, education awareness, transparency, reducing program costs, net savings, and also making sure that there are evaluations and sort of like you're figuring out your progress towards your goals and adjusting along the way. The next slide I'm actually going to skip, but it is just sort of emphasizing the importance of evaluations for this. And then I'll just skip to the last slide on main takeaways. Just that DERs, distributed energy resources, can improve affordability. And this does require some sort of thoughtful design, and each program will kind of vary program by program, and it also can have co-benefits. So really thinking about the different goals you might have with programs like this. And there are obviously different trade-offs when considering these different design characteristics. So that is that. I think I'm out of time, so I will stop there, and thank you all.
Thanks, Sydney. Does anybody have any questions or want to make any comments on anything that Sydney has talked about? All right, we have one comment in the chat. Lots of the affordability strategies for rates and efficiency programs seem to demand behavior change or add burdens on low-income households. Are there ways to more effectively avoid these added burdens or take behavioral economic insights into account in the design?
Yeah, so the different behavior changes, I suppose that is referencing demand response. So energy efficiency is more passive, as is rooftop solar. You kind of install it and it does its thing. For demand response or batteries, those do require some sort of attention, like when you are increasing and decreasing things, when you are discharging or charging. And I think that there are a few different ways to do that. So some are behavioral, so it's voluntary, like we're going to give you these price signals and ask that you do this. Another is, you're seeing, especially with battery storage, more of direct control of the device. So it just would basically be the household agreeing, like, yes, I would like a free battery, and I would like to always have 20% charged in case of an outage. But beyond that, you can use it for X number, some defined number of events for Y amount of minutes, and you can do whatever you want with it. And I don't have to necessarily like toggle yes or no. I can just sort of opt in or opt out. So I think that, with those just in general, this is not just for low income households, but it is a bit less hands-on in the case of a household. Also, these programs are all voluntary, so no one is sort of demanding that that they participate in this battery program. I will say that the things that maybe are mandatory, might be like you get this free battery, but then you are obligated into this program. But usually those still have some sort of opt-out ability.
There's a lot of automated technology, like the most common for residential, the most common demand response program is smart thermostats. So that's a set it and forget it. So, and often the thermostat is free. So, so I think it's very important to take into account what behavioral changes might be needed, but what certainly utilities are primarily doing is, programs that take that into account, just make it easy.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, direct load control programs where customer, could opt out even of a direct control event depending. But the utility or a third party is actually directly controlling so that the customer need not do anything unless they want to opt out.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like Jeff is up at bat. Here's one more question though that just came in. How do you go about getting data from several different vendors, for example, Google thermostats, to evaluate these programs?
So evaluations, there usually is like a program administrator, like it might happen at the utility level or at the state level, and they sort of hire a third party evaluator. And it can be kind of hard to find these evaluations, but it's not like Google evaluating it. It's usually there is a third party working with the utility or with sort of the state administrator, and through them, they're able to sort of consolidate, like have different data sharing agreements, et cetera.
All right, thanks. Let's go to Jeff.
And there's one more question
Oh, there
in the
is.
chat if we want to hit it real quick. I think we can adjust
Yeah,
it.
are you
Yep.
aware of any utility program designs that provide home batteries to existing net metered behind the meter, net metered or behind the meter solar systems?
There's these bring your own device programs where I think there are options, like either the utility can own the battery and then they have more control over it, or you have the battery. It could be any variety of vendors, but you have to sort of participate in a certain number of programs to get a certain level of monthly compensation. I think it's per kilowatt.
Sydney, do you know if the California program, or Sean, anybody, with the small generator program that now offers batteries, that's available to net meter customers, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure. There is a program where, and I don't think this is the California program, and I can't remember which one it is, where you can't be net metered, like you have to sort of participate more in like as like a non-wires alternative
Yeah,
type device. Usually
right.
those are separate though. So I do think the
Yeah.
California one is also net metered, and the bring your own device as well. So I think that's actually more common than the non-wires alternative
Mhm.
option.
All right.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. So a lot of what we're actually, that was a good segue into what my section of this training is about, which is about promoting affordability through load management, which we've just been talking about. But I want to make a kind of a distinction that, Sydney's presentation referenced kind of both some of the sort of individual customer benefits of demand response and other load management approaches. She also mentioned a little bit some of the grid benefits, but that second part is actually exclusively what I'm going to dig into here, which is the notion that through managing electricity demand and customer load, both temporally and spatially, we can potentially achieve a lot of system-wide cost reduction and thereby lower electricity rates for anyone who's on that in that utilities or service territory, whoever's receiving service through that offering. So let's go to the next slide, please. So first, the first point that I want, and this is probably not going to be a foreign concept to most of you on this call, but that I want to emphasize, and because this is important to understand the potential for load management to lower rates and increase affordability, is that most utility costs are recovered through volumetric rates. Right. And so you have either self-governing public utilities or you have investor-owned utilities that are regulated by utility commissions. Either way, this utility will basically, and this goes back to the bond right and the sort of principles of rate making, which I'm very glad that we got into a little bit. But the utility will establish a revenue requirement that basically sets the amount of revenue that they are going to receive from their customers through their electric tariffs. Right. And so this revenue requirement will recover whatever their allowed expenditures are, and then will also include a rate of return on whatever capital investments that the utilities own or have made recently. And so this revenue requirement, which basically just sets how much money is going to come in, is mostly spread across a utility's electricity sales. It's mostly recovered on a per kilowatt hour basis, and that is what sets electricity rates. Now, some of the revenue requirement is recovered through fixed charges that don't depend on the volume of electricity sales, but most of the revenue requirement is actually recovered in this volumetric fashion. And so that gets to sort of this very simple equation that I have at the bottom of the slide here that, electricity rates, and there's a lot more to it. This is a very oversimplified version, but are largely established by the lion's share of that revenue requirement divided by the number of kilowatt hours that the utility sells. And so from this, sort of simple equation, we can see here that if you have an increase in the revenue requirement that is not offset proportionally by an increase in the sales. In other words, if the numerator goes up more than the denominator, then rates will rise. On the other hand, if you have a lot of sales, but you don't have a big increase in the revenue requirement, then rates will fall. And so that second case is what we're interested in exploring here. And we're going to talk about how load management can result in increased sales without a large increase in the revenue requirement, and thereby reducing rates for the entire system. I'm not getting into here, and I know this came up in a question and also came up in one of the breakout rooms that I visited, questions of cost allocation, of which customers pay for which costs. And that can be a big deal for affordability as well. But really what we're talking about here is shrinking the entire revenue requirement so that rates in general fall across users. So this next slide presents something called a load duration curve. And the point that this load duration curve is making is that it is very expensive to serve electricity demand on peak. And actually, this slide doesn't directly make that point because there's no dollars on this slide. But what this slide shows is basically the x-axis is the share of hours that given generating assets, power plants, are running, and the y-axis is the share. And so what we can see here from this, is that there's a fairly large share of our generation assets exist to only support demand to support demand that only occurs a small amount at the time, right? So we have these various arrow stats written to this graph. About 80% of the time, about a third of the nation's power plants are not running. 95% of the time, about 20% are not running. So essentially, we have a small number, a fairly large number of power plants that really only exist to serve that peak demand, and that makes it very expensive to serve peak demand. And so basically, and we've been running load management as part of the, attempting to constrain the kind of the leftmost side of this graph for quite some time. And so actually these load duration curves, these are empirical curves. They actually already embed some load management that we've been doing. That said, a lot of studies tend to find that there is a lot more potential for managing load than we're not achieving the potential that we could for managing load. And so basically, you have this, only certain assets are not running very often. And so they're in a sense, you can think of them as contributing a lot to that revenue requirement because you had to pay for these plants, but they're actually not operating during very many, they're actually not operating when we're selling a whole lot of kilowatt hours because they only come into play on those peak demand days. The next slide shows this is not just an issue for the electricity generation system, but is also an issue for the electric distribution system. And the distribution system is the poles and wires and transformers that you'll see outside your house that move, that are where power moves at a lower voltage to end users, and then they use so that it can be directly used by end users. It's kind of, you can think of it as everything from an electric substation on down. And so the point of this graph is we often think of this as being an issue at the bulk power level and the generation level, but it is also an issue, and perhaps even more so an issue at the electricity distribution system level, where broadly speaking, this is just one example for the PG&E system, Pacific Gas and Electric system, but this distribution asset load duration curve is everywhere below the generation load duration curve, which kind of says that for any given percentage, you have even a smaller share. For any given percentage of the year, you have an even smaller share of the distribution assets that are being utilized. So essentially, the problem is perhaps even greater at the electric distribution level. Next slide, please. And there's also a temporal dimension to this issue. And so this is Staten Island, and this is a distribution system graphic, but this is showing the available remaining capacity in the summer on various feeders, distribution system feeders, the lines that connect from the substations to end users. And also there's capacity at points on transformers, which are these devices that step power down on the distribution system to lower voltages that customers can then use. And on this graphic, we can see basically moving from the purple are feeders and transformers that have substantial remaining capacity to serve additional load in the summer. And going all the way to the light blue, these are transformers and circuits that have very little capacity remaining. And so if you have some new load and that new load is joining the system somewhere where the feeder is purple, there is a good chance that that's not going to require a capital investment. But if it's joining the system somewhere where where we have a light blue feeder or transformer, there's a much higher chance that will need to be accompanied by some sort of distribution system investment in order to serve that new load. Or perhaps we can manage the load in some way temporally to avoid that. But nonetheless, the point is, not only is there a temporal management aspect here, there could be a spatial management aspect to the extent that we can locate increases in load in places that already have the capacity to serve them and won't require a new investment to do so. Next slide. Okay, so basically the opportunity here then, this is just the idea in a nutshell on this slide, is that we can manage new and existing loads to reduce the need for new generation transmission and distribution assets to try to avoid these large, lumpy costly investments in electricity infrastructure as much as possible. And so by managing new and existing loads such that consumption occurs at times and places where the electricity system has available capacity, load management can contain electricity rate growth or even reverse it. So a couple related terms to know, and again, this overlaps a little bit with what Sydney discussed. Sydney talked a fair bit about demand response, which we define here as basically a change in the rate of electricity consumption in response to price signals or a request of a utility. So this is the change that actually occurs in the event that you either require require some action of a user or send a price signal to that user that they respond to. Demand flexibility, we generally use to refer to the kind of capacity or the capability to provide those kinds of changes if asked. So it's the capacity provided by distributed energy resources to reduce or shed or shift or modulate. We won't really talk about that very much, but in a sense, demand flexibility is the capacity. Demand response is what you actually get when you call on that capacity. Demand-side management is a broader term, and this refers to a whole variety of generally programs or other efforts to modify energy demand by customers. This includes things like energy efficiency, but it also includes demand response, can include distributed generation, storage, other things as well. So it's a bit of a larger umbrella term. And then there's the term virtual power plant, which I see coming up as I keep half an eye on the chat, which is an aggregation of distributed energy resources that can basically provide grid services that are in a sense like traditional power plants, but they are managing load to sort of drop load or shift load to various other times rather than providing additional generation to serve them. And so all these terms, there's a fair bit of overlap in it. So I just want to put them all in one slide. And when we use load management, we are intentionally using a broad term that encompasses all of that. Sydney's talked a bit about technologies, so I'm going to be brief here, but some of the key technologies. First of all, you need some advanced metering infrastructure that can record hourly or sub-hourly consumption. If you don't have that, it's very difficult to manage loads temporally in a way that helps here. Then you also want the loads themselves that can be shifted in time. There's a variety of loads in buildings and industrial facilities that can be shifted in buildings. Often it's space and water heating. Data centers are a real emerging. There's a lot of interest in assessing the capacity of data centers to be flexible because a whole lot of the new load that we think is going to be coming online is going to be coming from data centers and other large kind of large load facilities. We also communications devices are super important, which we talked about a little bit in terms of smart thermostats and sort of the ability to automate as many of these things as possible. Storage is important. Managing electric vehicle charging is of increasing importance. Next slide. Okay, so how do we go about doing this? And again, Sydney gave some examples of this, but there are basically, we have four sort of categories on this slide of approaches that utilities or their regulators or independent system operators may use to try to generally, it's not, it's not the utility that is directly managing these loads, right? Or at least it needs to be the utility in partnership with its customers, which is part of what makes all this a challenge. And so there are a variety of ways of approaches that we use for that. There are programs run by utilities or grid operators, and these are programs that basically pay customers either for the right to directly control their loads. We've mentioned direct load control programs already, or there are interruptible rates whereby a utility customer gets some sort of rate reduction in return for the utility having the right to drop load at various times and in various ways that are specified by that rate agreement. There are also programs that pay customers if they reduce load during events. So if there's a high usage day, the utility will say, okay, now we're making an offer to our customers. If you can reduce load below your baseline, you actually will get a payment for this. There are pricing strategies. Again, we've referenced those before. There are static or fixed time of use prices where generally there is a higher price during times of day and times of the year that tend to be peak demand times in order to deter consumption at those times, and then lower prices where when we're not anywhere near a peak, so that again, there's a lot of existing system capacity. And so if we can push load into those times, we can constrain our need to build new infrastructure in order to serve peak times. So there's static approaches, but there's also dynamic approaches. Again, critical peak pricing, real-time pricing. So these are approaches that depend on grid conditions, where there's actually going to be, they're more like events. So that you're going to call a critical peak, and generally the price difference there is significant. So that's, here comes a peak afternoon. We're going to raise your rate by quite a bit in order to try to deter that consumption. Or we're going to offer you a rebate that is fairly large in order to try to deter that consumption. So that's a whole family of strategies. There are also procurement strategies that leverage non-RILES alternatives. So this is a situation where we may be sitting, for example, somewhere in the electric distribution system, and we have load coming on to that feeder, or load coming on to a particular region of the distribution system grid. And rather than building additional capital infrastructure, building additional wires, or building an additional substation, perhaps there is a way to leverage a management strategy on that feeder through use of battery storage or through use of automation to keep the load low enough on that particular part of the distribution system that we can avoid making that big capital infrastructure expenditure. And so that is a procurement strategy that you'd say, okay, utility, rather than procuring this piece of capital infrastructure, I'm going to set up an arrangement with my users that will achieve the same thing through some non-wires alternative. And then the final bullet is in certain places, there are capacity or energy markets that allow users to bid demand reductions into a market. For example, in the PJM market, you can actually say, if you offer me a certain price, I will drop my consumption by a certain amount. And that's another way to sort of pay through a market for demand reductions. Importantly, all these things, I say the word customer a lot, but this is a point that also came up in the chat, that in many, many cases, there is a third party in between the utility and the customers in these arrangements, generally known as an aggregator. And so the aggregators interface with the customers and figure out how to deliver the load reductions that the utilities are paying for. So that's an important matter. It's not always directly from the utility or the grid operator to the end use customer. Next slide. Okay, so this is an example of a study, and this is a Berkeley Lab study that traces the dynamic that I'm talking about through into electricity rates. So this is a situation where my colleagues studied the electricity rate impacts of managed versus unmanaged electric vehicle charging. And so the graph that we see here is the delta between a managed approach and an unmanaged approach to electric vehicle charging. And I'm going to focus on the dark blue bars. Don't really worry about the light blue bars for the purpose of this conversation. And so what this shows, we have two different scenarios, a low EV penetration scenario and a high EV penetration scenario that this study modeled. And in both cases, if we manage that EV load to, again, occur at time, I think this is entirely temporal in this study, at times when it is cheaper to serve that load, at times when the grid is not stressed, at times when there are plentiful lower cost generation resources available, we can see this study actually traces the impact of that all the way through into the electricity rate and says that in the low EV penetration scenario, if you manage consumption, that EV charging, that will drop the rate down by 0.8%. And in the higher EV penetration scenario, it will drop the rate by a full 1%. That may not seem like a big amount, but these things add up, and there's a whole lot of customers that are experiencing that rate reduction, and it adds up to a whole bunch of money. Okay, and my final slide is just talking about that there are a variety of estimates of the cost-saving potential of load management that are out there. I linked a couple of them here that estimate various kind of in different ways, kind of go bottom up and estimate the amount of utility cost savings that could result from successful load management. And they both get into these, in the range of tens of billions of dollars. In one case, kind of across the utility system, in another case, just from residential customers. And so, it's a very large resource that's out there. And there are a whole bunch of different potential studies on the potential for load management. Relatively few of them get to costs and rates. So that's why I'm emphasizing the few that I've emphasized here. So with that, I will pause and ask for any questions now, and then we have our next breakout session as well. So do we want to take some questions now?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions or any comments about anything that Jeff has presented, now would be a good time.
I see that there are a couple things in the chat, but I have not had the chance to read them.
All right. One question is, can you please re-explain the procurement strategies? I think this was the pricing, programs, and procurements. We like to think of it as the 3 Ps.
Yes.
And I'll just chime in my personal
Please.
Opinion at this point, and I think shared by many others, that as much as I love the procurements, the request for proposals, it's been a rough ride over decades. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for programs. Ratepayers are already paying for programs, and they could be geo-targeted to get multiple benefits, including for specific places on the distribution grid. So you could provide a higher incentive without, asking for any more money from ratepayers. You could just target some of the incentives differently, or you can develop a new program. Pricing, once you have advanced metering, pricing can be pretty easy. And there are some utilities that are experimenting with distribution level pricing to try to reduce that. Jeff, I don't know if you have other comments there.
Yeah, and I would say the example given here of like literally reconfiguring power flows, yeah, that's great where it works. I don't know, hopefully that's something that the utility will find on its own, but perhaps not. But really, I think we're generally thinking about more strategies that involve more active customer engagement in changing the ways that they are going to, and the times at which they're going to demand electricity. I agree with Lisa. This is a big idea that has had relatively little, there are relatively few examples of big successes here. Everyone likes to cite the ComEd project that avoided a big distribution system infrastructure upgrade I can't remember which part of New York City it was actually, several years ago.
Queens.
Yeah, Queens. There we go.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of examples. It's just that I think there are other strategies that utilities are working on now. Here's another question. Let's see. Question about legal authorization. Do you need to have legal authorization to prompt alternative procurement strategies? I'm not sure where the question is going, Lucas. Maybe you can clarify, but I think so. Public utility commissions have broad authorities. And so they could readily require utilities to consider non-wires alternatives, to put on programs and pricing and procurements, ultimately, it's still the utility that has to make the decision and make sure that any strategies that they use ratepayer funds for are, cost effective and reasonable. But I don't know, Lucas, did you have anything else in mind? You can come off mute if you want. Or
Yeah, thanks so much.
Sure.
I think kind of getting to that, just wanted to see if there are any states that have sort of explicit statutory requirements to look at these, or if this is something that just PUCs are.
Yeah, so that's different, Lucas. I was going to say, I agree with Lisa. I'm not aware of a case where you needed a legal change to enable these strategies, but there are definitely states that have passed legislation to encourage/require these kinds of approaches.
Yeah.
So I can't remember offhand. I don't know if you can.
I'll
Lisa, I
put a
can't give
link
you
in
an
the
example
chat. We've
offhand.
got an annual catalog, annual updates to our state requirements catalog on all things distribution system planning related, including any requirements. So that the non-wires alternative consideration can be included statutorily, or it can be included just as a regulatory requirement on the commission's own motion. But that's a good question. Here's one more, Jeff.
Oh, yeah. Looks like this is a comment back to.
It looks like it is a
another.
comment.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it and maybe respond?
Where it's back to another user here that says the Massachusetts CEC is working on a vehicle to everything pilot program to study how bidirectional charging can potentially be used in the future to send energy back to the grid. Yes, but I think I will avoid taking the bait on the vehicle to grid topic, which we could talk about for the next 20 minutes. But sure, to the extent we could get that to work, that would be very powerful.
All right.
But with that, maybe we should go to our second breakout so that we have a little bit of time to come back afterward. Sanjana, were you going to set us up for that?
Yep. I will.
So before we go, Daphne, let's set up for that.
Okay.
Yeah, and sorry.